Hi, so my name is Katie Jane, and I have been very fortunate that over the past 15 years I have been able to travel to lots of parts of the world doing lots of exciting adventures. But my way into the world of adventure perhaps was a little bit different to most people, so it's actually that story that I'd like to share with you today. Now, after university, I quite by chance found myself building a fairly successful career as a model. I was doing lots of photo shoots and catwalks and promotional work and even body doubling in blockbuster movies. And yeah, straight out of uni, it was fairly well paid. It was retrospectively pretty easy and quite glamorous. And yeah, it was all good. But then I went on a ski holiday to the French Alps with my family, and I met a man. Now, that man, I was actually staying in his house through some family friends, and I just, on initial thoughts, he was a very weird Frenchman. Now, the reason I thought that was because on the first morning, we were there, we all come downstairs for breakfast before going out skiing, and Taka came downstairs fully kitted out in kind of clothing designed for the Arctic, so kind of -50, big thick clothing with these skinny Arctic skis under his arm. And somebody said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm just off to throw myself in the frozen lake and time myself getting out to make sure I can do it before hypothermia sets in. And he said that really matter-of-factly. I'm thinking, weird. Anyway, this was cemented even further when I think the next day, I'm doing my best to ski down a nice easy blue run, and I passed Taka skiing uphill, dragging behind him his mother. Now, it turns out that Taka is actually a polar explorer, and this all makes perfect sense if you're training for a polar trip. But I didn't know this, so I just thought he was particularly odd. Anyway, our misguided impressions of each other quickly vanished, and actually by day 4 of the trip he asked me if I wanted to walk to the North Pole with him. Now, this isn't a Chatterbird line I'd heard before, it was quite new to me, and I obviously said no. What on earth would I want to do that for? But more to the point, how on earth could I walk to the North Pole? Now, I didn't know much about polar explorers, but I definitely had an image in my head of these macho, strong, stoic men. So I was thinking, I don't really think I look like them. I'm not sure I fit the bill. And I had heard of Sir Ranulph Fiennes because he actually lived not far from me down the road, and I'd heard tales of how he'd come back from the Arctic with frostbite in some of his fingers, and then he'd actually cut off his own frostbitten fingers in the garden with a hacksaw. And I'm like, whoa, I can't do this, I am a girl that has been known to cry over a broken acrylic nail. So yeah, worlds apart. I can't do this. But anyway, Taka, he actually just over time convinced me that we are all so much more capable than we think we are, and that I really could do this. And he kind of asked me to find out what it was that was really stopping me saying no. And after a lot of thinking, the only thing I could come up with was just the fear of the unknown. And that really isn't a reason to stop us trying new things in this world. So I eventually agreed, but under the condition that perhaps I start with something a little easier, kind of to dip my toe in the water of this adventure world and see what I was made of. And just it came out of my mouth that, I know, why don't we walk the Great Wall of China? Now, I will confess that I had absolutely no idea when I suggested that it would be a 4,500 kilometre journey from the most westerly terminus to the most easterly terminus, that we would be going through the Gobi Desert in +40 degrees, right through to snow-capped mountains in -35. And I definitely had no idea that no one in the world would have ever walked this full length of the wall. It was just something that was on my bucket list of things to do. I think many of us have them, and it was just something that I was going to kind of go and see, maybe for a couple of weeks, take a couple of pictures. That's kind of all I had in mind. But yeah, Taka had run with the idea, and there was no stopping it. And it actually turns out that I could have walked to the North Pole and back 5 times in the journey that it took me to walk the Great Wall of China. Now, with a little bit of research, I was very quick to find that actually the Great Wall isn't one long wall. again, didn't know much about that. And it's actually lots of walls going in all sorts of directions from lots of different dynasties. And actually, if you added all those bits of wall together, it would be 50,000 kilometers, which was definitely too much for my first go at adventuring. So walking from one end to the other was what we decided to do. Now, I needed a fair amount of training to get my very weedy modelling body into shape to be able to do this journey. And so the physical training that I did was I actually got a backpack that I filled with sand to about 30 kilos, which is going to be roughly the weight of the pack that I was going to be carrying on the journey, and then just started walking. I could only manage 1 kilometre at first, and even that was hellish. But over the 6 months that I had to prepare, I just slowly increased that distance until I could carry that weight for about 35k a day on back-to-back days. I also had to learn lots of other things, kind of wilderness first aid, navigation, the routines of tent life. You know, it was all completely new to me. I also needed to get fatter, which was actually mentally the thing I found hardest in all of the training, because I had spent the last 5 years of my life thinking that anything more than a lettuce leaf was, you know, the work of the devil and to not go near anything with calories. And suddenly I needed to actually put on 2 stone in body weight ready for the trip. And it was summer and I was being a little bit vain, so I kept putting it off. But eventually I did put on the weight. I had a lot of, you know, high calorie foods, a lot of cake. I'd drink olive oil. I'd put double cream on my cereal instead of milk. Yeah, it was all quite revolting, but it did the job. And yeah, I had put on the weight before we started, ready, so I had a buffer for when I started to lose the weight quite quickly when I was on the move. And then, yeah, just like that, it was time to go, and I made this tremendous change in life as I knew it, swapping my kind of high heels for hiking boots, and off I went to become an adventurer. So here we were at Yumenguan in the Gobi Desert in China, the start of the Great Wall of China, which was nothing more than a little mound of sand, which is in the guidebook. So it was easy for us to get a taxi there because other Chinese tourists go there and have their picture taken. So we were able to do that. But the first task of the journey was to be left there. Now, we had very little Mandarin skills, obviously, and trying to explain to the taxi driver and the other taxi drivers that kind of gathered while we were chatting that we, in fact, want to be left there when there is kind of nothing in any direction around this mound other than just barren sand. But we were trying to explain that, no, we want to be left there and we're going to walk across China and that we're professionals and we'll be fine. And yet all they were doing was kind of trying to say, no, you can't, you'll die, it's too unsafe, it's dangerous. And, you know, bearing in mind I have been crying pretty much the entire journey since I left Heathrow and I'm trying to fight back the tears and say to these people that no, we're professionals, this is what we do, we're adventurers and we're going to be just fine. But really, you know, inside I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I can't do this, they're right, I really want to get back in that taxi. But eventually, under a lot of kind of shaking heads and tuts, they left us there, and yeah, it was time to start. And we looked out, as they said, on nothing. And I had to fight back those tears and take those first steps. Now, it didn't really get any easier anytime soon. The first 4 days, somewhere along the line, I got some contaminated water. Now, obviously in the desert there isn't much water, so when we found any we had to drink that, and we did try and filter it and everything else, but that had gone wrong somewhere in the line because I then got incredibly bad gastroenteritis, lots of vomiting and diarrhea, and our speed across the ground became very, very slow, and I was just, really, really unwell. But you know, we're only 4 days in and I'm refusing to kind of stop. I'm like, no, it will pass, I'll be fine, we just need to keep moving. So we did, but after day 6, by that point I was so poorly I couldn't stand. And in between the kind of bouts of diarrhea and vomiting, I was just coming in and out of consciousness. So yeah, it became a critical situation. And so Taka made a makeshift shelter for me where he left me in the desert with a satellite phone, and then he ran back the way we'd come through the desert to try and find some help. So he made his way to a kind of dirt road and waited there for many hours for a vehicle to come down it. Thankfully one did. It turned out to be a busload of people, very apprehensive people, because this is probably the first time they'd ever seen a Westerner, and he stood in the middle of the road kind of waving it down. There's no way this vehicle isn't going to stop. And then when it stops, he comes on board and he's trying to communicate through charades that his girlfriend is dying in the desert and they must turn off the road and drive through the sand to help me. Which eventually they did, thankfully, and I'm sure they had no idea really what was going on, but when they did get to me, they could obviously then, it all made sense, and in military fashion, Camp and me were whipped up and put on the bus and taken to hospital. I then spent 4 days in hospital, being looked after and a long time on a drip. Yeah, we're only in week 1, so I'm definitely not doing very well. I'm not sure I'm cut out for this adventure life. But equally, no one at home thought I was cut out for this adventure life. I'm pretty sure my family and friends actually had a sweepstake on me, and it would have been for days, not weeks. So yeah, I really wanted to prove them wrong. So as much as it would have been a very good time to say, do you know what, I'm not cut out for this, we're going home. But no, as soon as the hospital discharged me, we got a taxi and we got that taxi to drop us off at the point where I'd become ill. And of course had to go through the same saga of explaining, no, you're going to leave us here and we're going to head off through the desert and walk across China and we'll be fine. And he's going, no, you're going to die. Yeah, so that was a little tricky, but we restarted and on we went. Now, to cover the distance of the wall, we had 6 months. That was as long as I could get visas for us. So that meant we had to cover, on average, 35 kilometres a day, not taking into account hospital visits. So, yes, we had to keep moving forward every day for at least 12 hours a day. Now, sometimes we'd manage our 35k or more really easily, and there were times when we only made 1 kilometre in 12 hours due to terrain. So it was definitely very varied and tricky terrain. For the first month of our journey, there was actually no wall at all. It had been eroded over time because it would have been made of sand. And so we just walked along the line that the map said the wall once was on. Then as we moved further east, the wall became a little bit more prominent, but it wasn't there all the time. And then when it was there, it was sometimes just a little mound of earth. Like, you really wouldn't know it was the Great Wall of China unless you had a map to tell you it was. It most definitely wasn't this stone structure with steps that we all kind of have this image in our mind of. In fact, that was probably 1% of our entire journey, was that kind of the Great Wall that we kind of think we know. So coming from zero experience in expeditions and adventures, like, my mind just like fried at the concept of walking 4,500 kilometres. In fact, it completely struggled with the idea of walking 35 kilometres a day. So all I could do to make this trip manageable was break it down into 1 hour blocks. I would just tell myself to not think anything beyond 1 hour and just put one foot in front of the other for the hour, and then at the end of that you could have a very short break, and if we had one, hopefully a biscuit as a treat. And that is the only way that I could make this entire journey manageable, 1 hour at a time. Now, of course, it wasn't plain sailing. There were plenty of testing moments. Not only was I in hospital early on in the trip, I was also in hospital further down the trip with compression of the spine. Just through the weight of my heavy pack, my weedy body had been condensed down to the point that I actually lost nearly an inch in height by the end of the trip. We also were hit with like really big sandstorms. We were hit with the worst snowstorm to hit China in 50 years. We had to cross lots of frozen lakes that weren't as frozen as I would like. Sometimes we went days without eating, like 2 or 3 days with no food. We had frost nip at times, foot rot at times. Yeah, and far cry from my modelling days, I actually had 1 set of clothes and 2 showers in 6 months. And as you can see from this picture, one of them is the top that I wore and one of them is what the top looked like to start with. So they should be identical. So pretty disgusting. But as much as I spent a lot of time feeling very sorry for myself and longing to be back home on the sofa watching television, in fact, I think I might have potentially cried a little bit every day of the journey. But as much as all of that, was hard, China was just such a fantastic country for lifting your spirits, because every day, around every corner, showed me something new, something I had never seen before. Super-sized vegetables, camels pulling coal carts. But even better than the incredible sights we saw along the journey were the people. I mean, wow. I've been fortunate since China to have travelled a lot of the world and still have never come across hospitality in quite the same way that we received in China. I mean, they would just give us everything they had and want nothing in return. And bear in mind, these people in rural China, had never ever seen a Westerner before, and here am I, 6 foot tall, blonde hair, wearing kind of bright pink suit from head to toe, arrive on their doorstep. It really was like an alien had landed. And of course they were a little bit apprehensive at first, but as soon as I would smile, then they would smile, and they would just welcome us into their world, and were just absolutely fantastic. And it's those memories that will absolutely stay with me forever. But so before we know it, 167 days later, I've walked the wall. And it was really mixed emotions at the end. I was super, super proud of myself, super happy that I had achieved what I'd set out to. But I was really sad for it to be ending. For 6 months, this way of life, this really simple way of life, very primal in the fact that you just had to think about food, water, shelter, and keep moving. That really was all we had to think about. I was not looking forward to kind of going back to real life and first world problems. I really enjoyed the simplicity of life on the road. But my parents were there at the end. They were stood on the kind of last step of the wall, and so it was incredibly emotional as I took my last few steps and got there and gave them arms out, this massive hug to both mum and dad. And as quickly as I grabbed them, they both kind of recalled back and started retching, it turns out that one set of clothes in 6 months is pretty eye-watering. but I'd done it. I had gone beyond my limits, and I was a completely different person to the girl that started this journey and had this newfound self-belief. And I'd kind of realised that actually the feeling of accomplishment or success, whatever you want to call it, is directly proportionate to the effort, the hardship, and the commitment that I put in. If I'd got to the end of that wall by any other mode of transport, it probably wouldn't have felt at all as satisfying as the fact that we'd walked all the way there. So with this newfound self-belief, on the trip home, I'm already planning my next adventure. Like, this is it. I had opened Pandora's box onto this world of adventure, and it's most definitely something you can't put the lid on, in my opinion. And so my mind was working away of what was next. Before I knew it, I had been on multiple expeditions to the Arctic Ocean, living on floating sea ice in minus 50 degrees. I'd cycled down Africa on a 30-year-old bicycle bought in the Sahara for a few dollars. It had no brakes or gears, and in fact it had one wheel bigger than the other. I had become the first woman to ski across the world's 3rd largest ice cap. I'd hiked solo across Iceland. I'd raced my bicycle across continents, amongst many other trips, and am also now an expedition guide. But please don't be disillusioned. I am inherently lazy. I am not brave. I am not a daredevil, not an adrenaline junkie. In fact, I'm a very ordinary person who is pretty much nervous about everything. But China changed my life. It taught me that really ordinary people can do extraordinary things if we really are just bold enough to begin. So with that, I would like to leave you with 3-minute footage of my journey along the Great Wall, where it all began. Thank you very much.